Um, Good evening. Happy early Halloween. Nobody came dressed up. My name is Paul Davis. I'm curator of collections at the Menil, and I really want to thank you all for coming out this evening to have a conversation with Sam Gilliam. There are many people that need to be thanked, and I'm doing this new thing with the thank you slide. But I'd like to single out a couple people. First, Annie, thank you very much for all your help in organizing and helping Sam get here and coming along. And of course, Jonathan Binstock, whose work on Sam Gilliam has been very informative on my ideas about Sam Gilliam and was a big part of that retrospective. And to all the Menil staff and people who don't often get mentioned, a real thank you for all the hard work you put into the two events and also to the exhibition, Affecting Presence. And lastly, to Mark Walrow and Melanie Gray for their underwriting of the exhibition, Affecting Presence. So thanks. Just a couple quick introductory words to this man to my right. And I'm going to read. A prolific artist and a thinker. Working in multiple mediums, Sam Gilliam is most frequently associated with the artists of the Colorfield School in Washington, D.C. His artistic career is long, his work is ever-changing, and his accolades are many. Gilliam's history with Houston and his connections to the Menil collection are rich. While working in Washington, D.C., Walter Hobbs recognized the innovations in Gilliam's work in the 1960s and supported Gilliam's pursuit of abstraction and becoming an abstract artist. Hobbs selected Gilliam's work for the American Pavilion in 1972 at the Venice Biennale. Before he became the founding director of the Menil collection in 1987, Hobbs also oversaw the acquisition of Gilliam's painting, the Cedar Moritz over Mondrian, which is a painting from 1984, which features prominently in the exhibition Affecting Presence and the Pursuit of Delicious Experiences, which is down the hall there. Gilliam's connections to Houston and the Menil collection are still more. A year before the Venice Biennale, Gilliam had been one of the participating artists in the 1971 Deluxe Show, an exhibition in the historic Fifth Ward of Houston organized by Peter Bradley and backed by the de Menils. More recently, a major retrospective of his work organized by the Corcoran Gallery of Art traveled to the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston in 2007. The exhibition was bolstered by Jonathan Binstock's incisive observations about Gilliam's career and artistic innovations. Binstock notes that many of Gilliam's most important artistic achievements, quote, incorporated ways of working and aesthetic ideals that were overtly antithetical to the color school modes and tenets, end quote. Indeed, Gilliam's work is difficult to categorize. Is it color field? Is it gestural abstract painting? Is it in fact painting? Or is it sculpture? For me, Gilliam's work is about process, construction, space, and perhaps most powerfully, color. The methods of getting paint to the support and the manipulations through folding, raking, layering, and cutting, etc. What is the most important thing about medium and process? Space and progression in the cycle of question, resolution, and question? Or perhaps it's a more tangible things, it's about more intangible things, as Gilliam himself has described his work as the total presence of the course of man on earth. Tonight, we are extremely fortunate to extend our conversation with Sam Gilliam. Please join me in welcoming him back to Houston and back to the Menil. Okay, so we'll start. The painter. So what I thought we would do is we'd start with the conversation about these two quotes, and we talked about this. We've been talking about this, but these two quotes really informed my understanding of your painting and the way that I incorporated them into the exhibition. This idea that abstract art is a holistic experience. It's not just something you look at, it's something that you're embodied. And that art has to be the quest for something.
True.
Yeah. And I love how open-ended that is. I love how it doesn't define what that something is.
Right. Go on.
Okay. Well, over the long career, so when we look at your work in the exhibition, I mean, this something that you were pursuing with these paintings, which come from the 1980s. Can you talk a little bit about how this was what the painting was trying to achieve? And can I have my notes?
All right. The main thing is support, not the actual support of the work, but support of the career. It's a gamble to actually stay alive in art. And living in Washington, most of the galleries were in houses. And the experience was making them small to fit in small spaces, and large to fit in spaces for which that I had commissions. So I guess the important thing was being a young artist, is that I observed the color fill painters, Morris Lewis, Kenneth Nolan, and particularly Tom Downing, who attended a show of mine when I first showed in Washington. And I had one watercolor and a gallery full of figurative drawings and figurative paintings. And I recognized him from an artist that I'd seen in the newspaper. So for the first and the last time in Washington, I asked him, what did he think? He said, this is a pretty bad show. But you have one good thing, that's the watercolor. And that shows you're not scared. So
it's about risk and
right.
taking that gamble,
yeah,
and embracing it.
So we became friends. He was the guy I wanted to talk to. So I asked him, when you came to the show, did you come to see the paintings? He said, no, I saw there was wine on the table. I came to get a drink of wine. So that was the beginning of a long friendship.
Well, we have this photo of you from the 1980s by Barboza, where you're immersed in the process of painting, but it's
yes, this is quite a bit further from the time in Washington back in 1962 where I arrived, and one of the main things were acquiring a studio. But first, since I had 3 kids, was to acquire a place for them. So we lived in a small house with a nice basement. And so I painted in the basement. And that's when I met Walter.
In the mid-60s.
Yes. Yeah. And he suggested that he had ideas, and most of that was getting studios for artists, so that he was director of a collection of paintings, modern paintings, in a place called the Corcoran Annex. So he sold the paintings to Oklahoma. And the receipts from the sale of the work was distributed around two artists, myself and a sculptor, I think 4 photographers, Andrew It, another sculptor, and 2 architects. One architect became immediately famous. He developed Cadillac Ranch, and the other went to South America, never to be heard again. So that the real idea was having a space to work in, and a space to discover myself. And I set myself a curriculum between Washington and New York. First, I followed the color field painters in the early 60s. And I don't think Walter liked color field painting.
Really?
Yeah. Or he didn't like Greenberg. Or he didn't like the absence of adventure in Washington as he had it in California. So that
and being on the cutting edge of Californian.
Cutting edge of California painting.
Yeah.
And also being involved very much in New York. Also the cutting edge of New York painting too.
Yeah.
Or New York artwork, Donald Judd, Frank Sella, I think were of particular interest.
Well, so, I mean, we're talking about Walter Hobbs, and here's Keane Holtz's kind of play off of Walter Hobbs and a visual pun. But I wanted to talk really quickly about the new work.
Yeah.
And where you find, before we get back into the 1960s, I wanted to talk about where you find yourself now as a painter. And having been through the evolutions of painting in the 1960s and forward, and where you find yourself now with these paintings here.
Well, in 2005, it was sort of a real assessment and a retrospective with Jonathan Binstock. And the end of the retrospective through the early drape paintings, black paintings, white paintings, paintings on metal. The last room were a series of paintings of solid color that were called slats.
Right.
And
which is this
series, the continuation.
But on these, you're not using metal anymore. These are birch plywood supports.
Yes. One of the real things consistent with making art was moving from place to place with the family until we finally, after a grant, acquired a large house, 3-story house on Lamont Street. And I made a studio at the top floor. And then I had a studio downtown, 30 by 50 feet. And I used both studios, made watercolors at home and painted downtown. And I sold that studio and have a great studio now, newly built.
It is a great studio.
And
this is actually the photo from the studio.
And at the same time I have the studio, I got a gallery in California. And with interest in all the older paintings that I had, and since I'd shown in small galleries, I had a batch of large paintings, wall size, in fact. And those were the paintings that the gallery was interested in from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And so I could almost retire. I didn't have to paint for a gallery. I mean, the paintings that were shown were the old ones. So the studio was just constant, slowly putting together what it was that I wanted to. And one of the big issues all along had been, while building the house, moving the windows from regular-sized windows, all the windows being lower to the floor. A friend of mine said, well, you know, if it's windows that you really want, we could order stretchers as windows. So we designed the stretchers and went to a company called Arlington Woodwork, and I would get these big stretchers, big windows, delivered. And it was such a great occupation making those stretchers that the two men who were responsible within the company for making the stretchers decided to freelance and open their own business, so that I would then, as opposed to going to Arlington, I went to Hagerstown in Maryland for stretchers. At that time, I had an apprentice that came from Cranbrook who was good at architecture. That was Steve Fretch. And all he did was draw. He drew stretchers, and also, as it made maquettes for commissions.
And this idea of stretchers will come back when we talk about the drapes.
Well, the idea of the stretchers also became functional because we set up a carpentry shop in the studio, bought lots of tools. It's really well equipped. Yeah. And Steve would make the stretchers. And alternately between working with metal, we also work with wood and plywood, that is, or birch. So that in the new studio, the architect of the stretchers are like drawings, and they come apart.
Are they like a puzzle piece?
Right. Yes. If you see in the yellow painting,
I think I have.
It's the corner triangle. Well, go back.
Go back.
The corner triangle and the vertical slot. Those are all three separate pieces, and could be taped, and could be poured, several layers of color, and then put back together, so that these are only a few of the paintings that were actually made, I think, in the last 4 years. So that they were simply painted and stored. And between making paintings, making drawings, and making watercolors, and receiving checks from my gallery in California, I sort of began to have it quite nice.
Very nice.
And
how do you see these? How do you see these in relationship to because you were talking about how the way they're constructed together and they're put together. How do you see those in relationship, say, to the earlier series of work where there are also these constructions?
Well, show the commission piece, Davis Square.
The Davis Square.
That one.
Yeah.
This was an early and major accomplishment. I mean, next to the early stripe paintings, the drape paintings, and the commission pieces, which were always large in wall size, is that we started to make the metal paintings sculpture with a D for Davis Square.
Right.
And we had quite a number of experiences with actually painting the metal, realizing that we couldn't paint it within the studio because of the toxicity. And we looked for a painter. Steve first sought a painter, an automobile painter, who said he could do it. He said that this was like trick painting, and he was good at that. So we deposited our metal with him, gave him a deposit, and waited for about a month or so, and went to where he was supposed to paint him. And his wife said that he was gone to Florida to play the Greyhounds. So went to the police station, so our charges against him, and took our metal and found out that there was antique car finishing places. So this became the real experience. We never saw the trick painter again, but we had an excellent antique car place that painted paintings, painted metal.
And this is a significant public sculpture in that it was one of the first ones that you started to incorporate aluminum, which is one of your preferred materials.
And it became actually one of the tools that were was introduced to the studio. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Do you want me to just tell me when you want me to stop?
Go to the beginning.
All the way back?
Wait, yeah. Right here.
Okay. It's your show.
Well, the excitement of metal, the pleasure of having a studio assistant, and really accomplished ways of working from drawings. We bought a computer. We started doing computer drawings. We started making models out of board. And I had, through several series of paintings, I arrived at this idea of cutting out the paintings and making them like puzzles, so that each color was actually painted separate. We made a drawing for, or a model for the painting, and then
for this painting?
Yes, fitted the pieces in, flipped them over, and glued them from the back, and then started to incorporate metal. Oh. And next.
Do you want to go? Can we talk about these for a second? These other new works, this other series?
Well, I'd rather go back and talk in order.
Older?
Back to the, keep going. Yeah, right here. Let's start in 1965 and I'll be a bit more organized. I started painting on boards, just on canvas, using masking tape to separate the colors. Various sizes, making just diagonal stripes, which I did for 2 or 3 years. And then with the studio that was provided by Walter, which is 30 by 50, and the idea that I should advance, do something different, so that between New York and Washington and the Museum of Modern Art, introduction to much of the paintings of the 50s, I backed up to do just stained paintings, next, yeah. I moved into the studio actually on April the 4th, 1968, the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I set up the studio where that I could paint just on flat canvas on each side of the studio. Would just unroll canvas on the floor, mop the canvas down with a water tension breaker in order to open the pores.
The secret ingredient, right?
Right, walk around without a brush or anything, a bucket, and put the paint down. It was more about, I used to be on a drill team, so that I...
When you were in the military?
I went north, then south, then west, then east, and had a record player, and while the record played, is that I had made the paintings. And in the end, is that since I was taking paint from small jars, I could slash or make the dots and
the red splatters.
Right, and the paint would just skate across the canvas.
And this was also with the beveled edges, so this is
the beginning of the beveled edge paintings. And finally, is that the paintings were folded, sort of reminiscent of striping.
And they were wet.
And they were wet, yeah.
What was the reason? I mean, when you started doing the beveled edges, I know you started having them manufactured by window makers, ultimately. But I mean, when you were starting out with these beveled edges, what was the intention, or was there an intention, or was it an experiment? I mean,
after Washington, I had my first show in New York in 1968. And a friend of mine said, why don't you do a painting the size of the wall? And the wall was 30 feet long. So I made a 30-footer. And I had a nice title, Sock It To Me. And they did. I also made a 17-footer for the opposite wall. And at the opening, the gallery dealer cut the lights out. And then he informed me that this was a gallery for selling, not for a gallery of making a career. So we had words.
So you couldn't sell a 30-foot painting?
No, he couldn't sell a 30-foot painting. And I got to keep it. But at least the experience meant that the studio, in '69, the following year, I started to make the same paintings, of which that most of them were at least beyond 10 feet, 20 feet, etc. And this series, which was the Martin Luther King series, next.
With Red April.
This is also based on the month of April, the month of this assassination. I did about 7 of these, a red April, a blue April, a green April, each year after that. And all of the paintings were actually painted on the floor, folded. There was an interesting thing about the studio. We had a space heater, and that with the space heater turned up, I could finish the painting in a short period of time, turn on the space heater, go to the movies, come back the next day, and the painting was dry. So that this sensational process meant that maybe during a week I could paint 4 paintings or so. Or if I was painting smaller, I could paint many more. And all of these were rolled up and just stored in the studio. Most times not being able to sell them.
And this is before. This is really at the same time you're starting to experiment with removing the canvas from the stretchers and explore that with works like Light Depth.
Yeah, well, this started as a challenge. Walter got a promotion to the Corcoran Gallery on 17th Street from the small annex in DuPont Circle. And for his first show, he utilized 3 artists, one with work with lasers, the other who work with plastics like shower curtains and things like this that were layered. And I had no choice but to change, because that I could make a stretcher that was actually 60 feet long again for a gallery that was 30 by 60 with 20-foot ceilings. And windows even at that scale would be very heavy.
Yeah.
So Walter said, you have a chance to do something new. So one day while holding paper, I decided with 100 yards of canvas, 4 rows, 25 yards long.
100 yards of canvas.
100 yards of canvas, 4 25-yard rows, to paint the whole 25 yards. And under Walter, it's that actually the galleries were literally being reconstructed. They had elevators, and I mean, not elevators, but large radiators in the center. And once they were removed, there were open spaces. So that by doing these paintings, these 25-footers, is that we could just drape the paintings in the space. And there were about at least 8 of them that initially was a part of a show called Gilliam, Krebs, McGowan. And the atrium, which was 2 stories high, I put 2 10-foot width canvases, had them sewed together for 20 feet wide, and went up to about 100 yards in length, and made enough canvases to actually drape from the entire gallery, I mean from the ceiling in the atrium, so that I had 3 spaces.
What was it that, I mean, what was it that really drove you to, was it to kind of integrate the viewer more, or was it, did that not play into your consideration at all?
No, I didn't have a dealer, and no one could tell me
what to do?
Yeah. So, being aided with a good museum director, we challenged ourselves, the guy with the lasers, the person that was working on shower curtains, and me. And since the space was actually new, we had the whole summer to work in the spaces. So to experiment, this was the gallery that was near 17th Street. There was the atrium, and there was an interior space. I started on the left-hand side with round paintings that were called carousels, and this Light Depth, which hugged to the wall. And I made a small painting that was called Genghis. And it was the greatest thing I've ever done. I got famous. Magazine articles and things like that. And I had been teaching, and I didn't have to teach. And I had smaller paintings that to make in the studio. I did commissions.
Something like
so that these were done for galleries. the smaller ones, commissions, studio assistants, so I could be an artist.
We've had a chance to talk a little bit about this painting in particular, because as being someone who studies the art from West Africa, and this being in 1969 after the Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres in Dakar, which you participated in but didn't go to.
Right.
Right. For me, this is a fascinating painting because it's a small portable, but it's after.
Right. One of the things about being an abstract painter during the 60s, with the growth of the Black Panthers, the demonstrations and things like this, and also the development or the use of the term black art, I didn't fit that. So, in fact, neither not only black art, but abstract art was enough to get you in trouble and to get you denied.
Well, that's a great segue. So we have this, which you start in the late 60s and kind of finish as an ongoing project
Right.
in 73, 74, and then ultimately exhibit in some form without the shoes.
Yeah. Those are my army shoes.
Those are your army shoes.
Yeah, and my draft card, my draft card is also there. I was out of the army. I cut the tops off, and that's a viewer. And in the first slide was
in the studio
was the gallery. Which is all of the overalls, jackets, lunch bag, army shoes, and a door
so
were
as an art
placed
historian-
against the wall.
So as an art historian, looking at something like this, you're constantly thinking, well, he's searching for something. He's looking inward. I mean, these are all his personal things, and they're being combined into this installation.
Yeah, this was a great opportunity because Marty Mayo became the director of the gallery. You could do anything you wanted to do. I did one painting called A Tribute to Muhammad Ali, and put sunglasses on the light fixtures. And an answer to the artists at Howard University who were called Afro Cobra, I did a painting called Dark as I Am. And this is at least the beginning. And over a period of 4 years, I took those pieces that were actually displayed against the wall, mounted them onto a door, and painted for 4 years. And that's the next slide. And there are 3 other pieces that are called Gel Jungle. My daughter, who went to school across town, just were dying to ride the bus like other kids, rather than to be driven. So we let her take the bus, and as she walked down the street, there were the gangs, the drug dealers, and things like this. She said, that place is like Jail Jungle. And it was so original that there are 3 other panels that are called Jail Jungle. And all these guys, the police were regularly handcuffing them to the telephone post before they would escort them to jail.
Yeah.
So that was before we did a very gracious thing of actually forming a boys' club and taking them on picnics and various things, and befriending them, and so that every now and then one would show up at the studio. One would turn into a plumber. The others just wanted money. We paid them off so that as we ascended that's the studios, the artists. We had all these friends, and we cared them. They didn't go to jail. So this was a piece that, with friends in New York, Mel Edwards and William T. Williams, who would actually had joined together for our first show at the Studio Museum.
The X to the...
X to the fourth power. We decided to do shows together, since that literally we were sort of not excluded, but not invited to museum shows in New York. So we did shows of our own. And this was a show was part of an exhibit at the Athenaeum, the Hartford Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut.
Do you think of it as one work, or do you think of it as multiple works in a stage?
We built a cube, a separate wall, and that you could walk around it. So that it was like a kiosk. And Bill had paintings and Mel had sculpture. They were able to sell work to the museum. And the director told me it looked like a corpse, so that I stored them, and I still have them.
Well, I think we should move on to, I can't bring you to Houston and not talk about the Deluxe Show kind of in depth. So kind of as a way to conclude our conversation, can we talk about a little bit about your experiences with the Deluxe Show and what that meant to you to participate, because this is before the Biennale. For Houston, it was a big time because, we had the Rothko Chapel was just installed, or just being built, and had just been finished, and so there was a lot happening here.
You had a neighborhood that was called within the Fifth Ward, that was better known as Bucket of Blood, and Peter Bradley became the curator. And what had always wanted to be said, even in New York, is that if this was a free world, show me against the white artists. So that he invited artists from the best gallery in New York, Emmerich, the best critic, Greenberg, and the best black artists. And we did a show in the theater in the Fifth Ward with Mick Leland, who had were being primed by the Menils to become effective, within the politics of Houston. Instead, that he became a congressman in Washington. But that was the event. And I came down from Washington, and Peter from New York, along with Kenneth Nolan, Greenberg, and we worked on a Saturday. But before we got started, we went to Stetson's, about cowboy boots, 10-gallon hats, cowboy shirts, and we were ready.
You had to fit in.
We're Texans.
Yeah, you're Texans.
But when we arrived at the gallery, it's that one of the persons there said that it was the wrong thing to do in this neighborhood, so that we hit the things. Peter maintained the cowboy hat, and Greenberg did all the exhibition paintings, and I put up the Dre painting. And by the end of the day, Greenberg was wearing the cowboy hat. And
was it just from fatigue, or was it?
No, he actually was the most important person there, because when the guys on the street, the winos, came into the theater, they wanted to know what we were doing there. This was their place. This is where you just watch cowboy pictures and all those things. And plus that is that there were white guys in there too. So that Greenberg immediately apologized and offered the guy $500 to buy a painting. And that was a nice ceremony, because they went marched around the gallery, and he selected a painting, and everything was all right. It was very, very cool. So that we continued to do the exhibit that would be open to the neighborhood. And it was yesterday that we went to see the new theater, and it's quite a reformation.
Yeah, it's amazing. Not that I remember conversations from 40 years ago, but do you remember what you were? Do you remember, talking with Jim Love and Peter about installing, or what the way in which you wanted to install the work, or?
Well, I was very quiet. There was an artist in Washington whom Walter was very fond of. His name was Carroll. Carroll was an artist that was referred to as being crazy. And he always talked about Greenberg. He had never met Greenberg. So Walter decided to send them to Texas. And Peter had met Carroll before, and Carroll often became very nervous and became disturbed. And Peter said, "This guy can't be here." He said, "He's crazy." So his being from Washington, I became his guardian. I defended him. And where Carroll go, I go. So that was one of the issues. But Carroll had a great time. He met Greenberg. So there was no problem. And yeah. And among many things that happened, it was meeting Mrs. Menil, Mr. Menil, Mickey, Leland, and
Mickey. This is you installing, rather.
Right.
Unrolling, pinning, roping. There's Mickey.
Yeah.
Mickey Leland.
And we accomplished something that could not be accomplished by demonstrating against the Whitney, demonstrating against the Metropolitan and things like this. We did our first, what was integrated abstract exhibit in Houston. And it became history,
yeah,
in the sense, and that I think this was also the time that actually is that, with Ralph Bunch's help, Mel showed at the Whitney, I showed at the Museum of Modern Art in a project. And we sort of bust open a kind of an opportunity that was extended.
At this moment, in kind of late
right,
late 60s, early 70s.
It's easy, yeah.
Well, I think what we might do is open up the floor for questions and allow people to kind of ask some questions.
Yeah. You could show the last paintings.
The last paintings?
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Okay. Well, I'm fine to continue it.
with the drape paintings is that, and with minimal art, the art world just opened up to younger artists. Shows at the Jewish Museum, principally the Whitney galleries in San Francisco, the Walker, newly built, and again the Philadelphia Museum started a project between the street and between the museum and the street. Gene Davis painted the street in 1 year. Rockney did lasers from the museum to the City Hall.
Rockney Krebs, your studio assistant.
Right.
Or, sorry, studio partner.
Yeah, along Ben Franklin Parkway. And they asked about me. And they gave me a choice of actually painting of doing the facing walls of the museum behind the steps that Sylvester Stone ran up in the film Rocky, so that there are rings around the museum. In the frieze, a Greek god who looks like Neptune. So I assumed the rings were for him to tie seahorses up, so that I did 6 panels. They were called seahorses. The museum had been sandblasted, it was clean. And on the day that the paintings went up, Hurricane Agnes came up the East Coast and was blown down. And the director of the museum says, if you're going to put those up, get them up and keep them up. Otherwise, leave them down and keep them down. So we put them up again, and they lasted the entire summer.
Was there another hurricane? No, there was no.
Well, the following summer we went to the Brooklyn Museum, and there was another hurricane. This time is that there was no choice of putting them up again because they blew over into the park. That was a real fierce.
It turned into a Cristo instead.
Right. They were beautiful. And Arboretum, and the Arboretum was filled with wild dogs. So we were not to rescue
not gonna go there.
And go back there, no. But, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is kind of the, the after product of having installed the seahorses on the Philadelphia Museum. Yeah.
We offered a chance to work at Art Park in the summer. The only thing is that we chose the sites during the wintertime, and this place, Custom Road, was one of the roads that were built to go to Niagara Falls. In fact, the columns on the right-hand side.
Up here in the right corner.
Yeah, was the first earlier bridge to across the Niagara River from New York to Canada. And the winds coming up the Niagara were so strong is that actually the bridge was blown down. But this is a nice place to actually work. One of the strange things is the colors even came out of the ground. They later defined it was chemicals, and now it's closed off. But it was a great summer using polypropylene, which I got from Phillips Fiber, which used for indoor-outdoor carpeting. And that with about a 500-yard roll is that we built fabric structures and later buried them wooden skeletons and things like this, and did a piece called Custom Road Slide. And this is just the beginning. The young lady was an intern. We had interns both from America and Canada, so that Art Park existed for a number of years. I understand it's open again. One of the interesting things that happened is that this land, which above the Custom Road, was a great expanse of road, which the kids who lived in Lewiston sort of claimed as their own. So as you would construct the sculptures in the park, they would come out about in the evening and reassemble them. This guy was using culvert pipe and coming down the hill. They took all the culvert pipe out, moved it back up to the hill again. That was that. You put it back, the next day you come back, it was up the hill again. So we had a very interesting time.
Well, I'm going to flip back to the more recent stuff that we were going to start off with and kind of talk about, and maybe we can open this up to the audience now.
Yeah, okay.
So that we can have some questions. Tony?
So I've got a mic.
But what I was interested in thinking about also was these cycles and series that you work in.
Yeah.
And how this most recent work on paper is really cycling back to these early works, like your Slice series.
Right.
And your members.
They start as folded pieces, but they change. I think I've been working on those for 2 years. And I have 4 tables set up in the studio. And they're painted 4 at a time until I start to keep, just flatten them and to paint 8 at a time. And to increase the size of the paper. And just paint, just make watercolors. And those are like always warm-up things that I used to do before. I used to paint the Beveled paintings. So now I have stacks of those. But in the meantime, in the studio, we painted the flat paintings and increasing those in size. That's where we have the solid color paintings that you showed earlier.
Yeah.
And this size now beginning to increase them in size. This is, I think, 5 by 8 feet. There's stretchers now being prepared for an 8 by 20 foot painting, as well as, I think, 8 by 15 feet. And we'll continue to make the paintings larger. And this work is called Dock. It's having to do with a ferry ride. And I'm still interested in color. I'm still interested in luminosity. And by using several layers of color, and then a glaze of silver paint, and then a varnish to finish the painting. The paintings shine, and the color is reflective. And now I'm just working. I'm not retired.
Well, that's great for all of us, I think.
Okay.
So if we can open up for questions, I think that'd be great.
I've got a mic here. Somebody has.
I've been really selfish. I keep asking things, and sorry.
Hi,
no
Sam.
Questions. No questions.
You've done a lot of work since your retrospective, so does that mean it's time for another one?
No. We're doing art fairs and interviews. I just showed in Frieze Masters in London, got great reviews, some slanderous reviews. The story of my showing in California is that a young artist, Rashid Johnson, recommended me. And he did a show with David Kordansky. And it was such a shock that it's rumored that they thought I was laughing, but I was actually crying. In fact, there's been a lot of crying between David and me and doing these shows because it's been very successful. And Rashid and I have had several interviews. We've done a series of conversations to the New York Times online. But the show at Freeze Masters was written up in The Guardian. And it said, after 40 years, this artist was discovered by a young artist, had his first show in California. He cried, but now he's making money. And now we're supposed to be presented on 60 Minutes. What a career. Okay.
So it just keeps getting bigger. Any other questions?
Yes.
Tony, over there.
There was one slide that you had roughly a half dozen pieces in your studio that were basically solid colors on that one. And they seem to luminesce so much from is that primarily a function of the spotlight, or is that the technique that you were speaking of?
It's a function of the preservative that happens as the final coating. But they are that luminous. And that's also the pattern or the means for making a series of works that are much larger. Ones that are more wall size. And there's an intentional glaze of silver before the last surface glaze that protects the color. But all the stretchers these stretchers are like, they're drawings too. And they come apart like a puzzle, and they're painted separately, and then they're put back together. And even when they're 8 by 20 feet, they're also made in parts and reassembled once they're painted.
I have a question. I know it probably varies from series to series, but I was wondering, perhaps maybe this is a good series, if you could discuss a little bit about how you choose colors. We talked a lot about the structure, but I'm curious, what that process involves.
Yeah. I called you once on the phone, and you were looking for the right blue.
Right.
I heard these things clinging around in the background.
There are as many colors as there are, that is at least from paint companies, almost just an enormous amount. So there's nothing about making a painting. My favorite color is yellow, so I'm going to always make a yellow painting, a blue painting, or a purple painting. But in the series, it's just continue to go through the whole palette of possible colors. And once in this scale, I start over bigger, and I'm fresh again. Red, yellow, blue, purple, brown, and it's interesting to see them on the same wall or in the same space. And it's spontaneous. And since I'm off from work, I just have nothing to do but to paint.
I think maybe one more question.
You talked a bit about your relationship to the color field painters in New York. I'm just wondering if in the 60s you were aware of the surface support movement in Europe and France, or what your relationship to other scenes outside of DC and New York were?
As the youngest artists, against the 6 color field painters that developed in Washington, I was the one that was never exhibited, so that I knew everything. I became friends of one, Tom Downey, who lived in Washington. I visited Nolan several times in New York and in Vermont. He recommended my going to Lenny Beaucourt, and I finally found out how to use water tension breaker, which was the means of soaking or staining canvas. And an entire generation of artists of the 60s were interested in the painting of Frankenthaler, Marsh Lewis, or Nolan, and that in any bar in New York, you got together, you talked about color field painting, or you talked about Rothko or Newman, and that you painted those paintings, and they're in your head. In a sense, it's that generation that you follow. The interesting thing is that after the Pollock show at the Museum of Modern Art, the following show was of de Kooning, and it was de Kooning's color paintings that supposedly referred to Matisse. And now that I'm older, it's thinking about the whole ball of wax, from the constructivists, Matisse particularly, Mondrian, and eventually Gilliam.
Well, I really want to thank you for coming to Houston and for sharing your time with us and for sharing your work with us. So thank you.